Steve here. It's the show where I answer your questions, and this week my first question comes from W. Mark Locker, who says, Steve, have these television shows exceeded their endpoint, The Big Bang Theory and The Simpsons? As a true nerd, i.e. social misfit who prefers science and tech to socializing, I first liked Big Bang, but as the series went on I realized the annoying laugh track being played wasn't laughing with me, but at me, which is when I stopped watching it. I've since heard Leonard and Penny got married, which I would think that should have been the end point, but still it goes on. The Simpsons, season 1 through 7, remains one of my favorites, but now I just say, how is that show still on the air? I've never watched a single episode of The Big Bang Theory, so I can't speak to that specifically, but yeah, I would say, I mean, it's what, in season 11 now? 10 or 11? Yeah, you'd be hard-pressed to find an example of a show that ran for more than 8 or 9 seasons that was still being very, very strong creatively at that point. It's just extremely rare. And with The Simpsons is maybe the most egregious example of all. I mean, it had that golden period of those first 7 or 8 seasons where it was just can't miss, just surefire every week. And then gradually it started to sort of drop off. And now it's at the point where, you know, it's running on inertia. And I still watch it, and I still like it. Like, I'm not someone who is I'm not one of the sort of cynical, bitter Simpsons nerds who is like, it was so much better back then, and now it's just terrible. Like, I don't think it's terrible, but it has definitely passed its expiration date, and it's way beyond time to wrap it up in creative terms. I mean, it still exists because it still makes enough of a profit for the network to keep it around, and the people who make it still want to do it. So, okay, I guess as long as both of those factors are in place, it'll keep going. But creatively, yeah, it's about 20 years overdue for a wrap-up, absolutely. And I've mentioned this before in a previous answer to a similar question. Like, I don't even know what the natural endpoint of The Simpsons would be at this point, you know, because the characters never age, and they've already done so many milestone episodes that, I mean, what do, you know? Kaylee Berkwin, I came across an interesting post on Tumblr suggesting those in the far right or other such labels see the world in terms of competition. The following excerpt explains it. Quote, whenever somebody gets called out for using blatantly offensive and discriminatory language, the far right always thinks that the response is entirely performative. Everybody that is offended isn't really offended. We are just performing offense in order to play nice with respectable society. In other words, we are all just playing a game, and the end goal is getting ahead. Everything is a competition. Social justice is just another element in the game, and some people choose to take that route in their quest for power and social capital. What are your thoughts on this? There does seem to be an element of what they do that on their behalf is performative, or at least performative to an extent. And they seem to assume that when people advocate for social justice, or people call out racism or sexism or what have you, that is performative as well. And in some cases it is. And I think when you do something like that in public, there's always an element of it that is performative. You should always be aware that people are watching you, and you should be tailoring your message and your method of delivering that message in such a way that it will be received by the people you hope will receive it. But the problem is with folks like the ones that are described in that quote is they assume that it's all completely disingenuous, that it's all entirely for show, and there's no truth underneath of it. That, as the quote says, no one is really offended. People are just going through the motions. And that lack of insight on their part into what drives the motivations of people who are genuinely interested in social justice is telling in terms of describing their behavior, and telling in terms of understanding who they are and how they see the world. You know, imagine reacting to racism, or imagine watching people react to racism or misogyny or some other form of discrimination, and not being able to fathom that people are genuinely upset by it or genuinely hurt by it. Like that doesn't appear to enter into the equation for a lot of folks that are on the anti-SJW side. Or if it does, they dismiss it. They say, well, those are feelings, that doesn't count. Imagine being that turned off, that cold, that indifferent to the experiences of other people that you just can't imagine being that genuinely upset about racism. I don't understand that, but I think that is a very key insight into a lot of people. I think that is actually right on in a lot of cases. And I think you see it in the kind of interactions that anti-SJW people propose with social justice advocates, you know, where they do view it as a game. They view it as a drama that we're all sort of players in. And okay, I did something to you, now you do something to me. Or, okay, yeah, we've had our little argument, but now let's do a live stream together and talk about it. And, you know, and that it really feels like they feel like we're all just playing the same game. We're all characters in a drama, and they're playing their part. Now it's your turn. You play your part, and then we'll both, you know, do well out of this. And I think that's a very sharp insight into the way they view things. It's not necessarily just in terms of competition. I think that's true too, but I think a lot of it is performative. It's theatrical to them. Bruce Bartup: we adults will straddle the pre and post Weinstein worlds. Children now will regard anyone who held such disgusting views or collaborated at all with the same horror and disbelief we reserve for collaborators with the worst dictators and slave overseers. Children to come may find it hard to believe. Comparing that arc with the efforts at character reform of, say, post-war Germany or Vichy France or post-apartheid South Africa, how much work do you think it will take? Do you think we'll make it? In some ways, I think it'll take even more work than those examples, and I think it will be even more difficult to bring about real change, because once the current phase of people coming forward and outing sexual harassers has passed, and I expect that'll continue for a little while yet. We've just, you know, heard things this week about Kevin Spacey and Brett Ratner, and I'm sure there will be more stories and more people who have been abused coming forward and outing people in the industry as sexual harassers or abusers. But once that is over, once the general public feels like, okay, we've rooted out the bad apples, the temptation will be to say, okay, problem solved, let's all go back to normal. And the problem is that normal is the situation that allowed those people to do those things in the first place. You know, when you talk about something like sexual harassment, I mean, the prevailing attitudes of men toward women, the prevailing depictions of the proper roles of men and women, the commonly held attitudes of men toward women and women toward men that are inculcated in so many of us from birth, those are the problem. And those are going to take a long time to change, and they won't ever change if we don't realize that's part of what we need to change. You know, rooting out the Weinsteins and the Kevin Spaceys and the Brett Ratners and all the other people who have committed these terrible offenses, James Toback, finding those offenders and revealing them and stopping them from hurting people anymore and holding them accountable is incredibly important. But so is changing the status quo that allowed them to do those things in the first place and get away with it and succeed despite of it, or, you know, in spite of it. So that's going to take a long time. I don't know if we're ever going to get to a point where we're completely over that. Zacchaeus 4. This isn't a question, but I hope you read it on the next episode. It's a response to the question about witnessing a rape and what should I have done. I have never been in that situation, but I have dated 3 women, all who had abusive fathers, and in all 3 cases I intervened on behalf of my then girlfriends. In 2, I made it better. In 1, I made it worse. But in 2, I got seriously injured, including once hospitalized for a neck injury. The father was much bigger than me and literally lifted me by the neck with one hand and threw me. That's the situation I made much worse. And hospitalized several days after fighting with one of the other dads with a badly bruised kidney. Having said all that, I was very lucky neither I nor the woman I was trying to help wasn't hurt worse or murdered. In hindsight, I think the only appropriate response in those situations is to call the authorities. Doing nothing is allowing someone to be harmed. Directly intervening has too high a chance of causing more harm. Unless you have no other choice, call the authorities. I think that's a good piece of advice. I know that if it's in a situation where someone is being attacked right that moment, I think it's usually a good bit of advice to call the authorities, call security, call the police, call whoever is there whose job it is to intervene in these situations rather than trying to do something yourself. Although I do also want to note that there are some people I know who have been in long-term abusive situations who would not want someone to call the authorities because they feel like that would make the situation even worse. So that's important to keep in mind too. If you know that someone is in a situation and they have made it clear to you or to someone else that you know of that they don't want the authorities involved because the involvement of the authorities will make things even worse for them, keep that in mind too. But in general, yeah, I think erring on the side of caution, calling the professionals, you know, intervening in that way, doing something rather than nothing, making sure that the person who is being attacked will be protected, but also doing it in a way that will ensure as best as possible the optimum outcome for them and protect yourself is the way to go. So yeah, I think that's a good statement that deserves to be added to the discussion from the question from last week. Johnny the Wolf. Hey Steve, what do you think of Philip Rose's Atheism Minus initiative? I think it has merit, but I cannot help but feel like an inclusive atheist movement should refer to itself as Atheism Minus, and the term would be better suited to the current wave of pretend atheists and skeptics who still whinge about Atheism Plus. And speaking of names, do you have any ideas for a better one? I thought of actual atheism, which I reckon may come across as just too passive-aggressive, as well as altruistic atheism. Yeah, how about humanism? I like that. Humanism is a good one. I think that Philip's Atheism Minus idea is a great one, and I am completely on board with it. I think it's a way of reframing the issue. Instead of framing it as Atheism Plus, as atheism, and then you're adding things on top of it, you're saying, look, let's just go with secular activism and building a strong, positive atheist community and atheist movement that can fight the battles that need to be fought in terms of, you know, religious overreach and separation of church and state and secular activism. But let's leave behind all the bullshit that other people have added to it over the years. The misogyny, the racism, the religious bigotry, the right-wing politics, the flirting with white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Let's just leave all of that behind. Let's subtract that, and then we'll go back to just positive, good, useful, atheist, secular activism. I think it's a great idea. I'm 100% on board with it, and I think it's a brilliant turn of phrase. Like it's a rhetorical stroke of genius to say, let's do Atheism Minus. It's very clever. So I'm totally on board with it. Animation. Hey Steve, with the holidays coming up, I was wondering if your family was very conservative, and if so, how do you handle political topics when they come up? My family is mostly conservative, although they're not super politically engaged. There's not a lot of political talk around the Thanksgiving table or the Christmas table, so I get off easy as far as that goes. Occasionally there is some political talk, and honestly, for the sake of peace and because I don't really see these people very often, or I'm not in a family dinner situation very often, I usually just grin and bear it and try to get through it, which I know is the coward's way to do it. You know, I feel like I should say something, you know, but I also realize that in most cases I would be talking to a brick wall. You know, I wouldn't really be accomplishing anything by speaking my piece or challenging something that they said. It would be mostly something just to make me feel better, so I can say, well, at least I said something, you know. But it wouldn't really accomplish anything. So in light of the fact that most of the time it's not that bad, and if I ever did challenge something, it wouldn't go anywhere anyway, I usually just keep my mouth shut, you know. And if someone says something truly egregious, like this has never happened before, but my wife and I have sort of a standing agreement that if somebody ever says something like truly egregious, like something just blatantly racist or something, then we just leave. We don't have an argument. We don't fight. We just say, okay, you know, hey, thanks everybody, Merry Christmas, and we just leave. But as I said, we've never had to do that. That situation, thankfully, has never happened. But yeah, that's how I deal with it. I mean, it's a shitty situation. I don't really relish the idea of having like political or religious arguments over the holiday dinner table, and unless something truly awful is said, I usually just grin and bear it and say, all right, it's just a couple hours a year, and then let me just get through it, and then that's it, you know. Yeah, I don't know. The nice thing is, with at least with my side of the family, the election of Trump has sort of, we even though we disagree on a lot politically, it has sort of united us in that. My father is much more conservative politically than I am, but we both are completely on the anti-Trump train. We're both just absolutely appalled by Trump and embarrassed and just aghast by the whole thing. So we have that in common. So in that way, it has brought us together. Things have gotten so terrible that it has actually brought us together. So that's kind of nice. For us. For everybody else, it's a living nightmare. Speaking of living nightmares, it's now time for
the lightning round.
Not the worst segue I've ever done, but then again, that's the very definition of damning with faint praise. The raddest scorpion. Speaking of not having shit around us, I've noticed YouTube started marking some comments as potentially offensive and keeps them pending for review so that the channel owner needs to approve them manually if they so want. Have you noticed this? How do you feel about this? I think it's a good idea. I haven't noticed it because I hold all of my comments for review and approval anyway, unless you are one of the relatively few who I have put on a pre-approved list because I know I can trust you and you're not going to say anything awful. Then your comments go straight through and I don't have to approve them. But most people's comments, I hold everything for review, so it doesn't really affect me. But for people who would find some use for that, I think it's a great idea. Radical Bacon, how boring would a real Steve Shives documentary be? Unless it was a long arc one, going from your more conservative ideas when you were a teenager and becoming less and less of a shit. That could be interesting. I guess it hinges on how fascinating you find me, though, and I don't even find myself that fascinating, so I think that would still be pretty boring. Yeah, he was kind of a shitty douchebag when he was a teenager, then he grew up and then he got into his 30s and he's a little bit less of a douchebag now. The Steve Shive story. Doesn't really grab me, you know? I don't think that's a project worth pursuing. Jay Dottify. Lightning round question. Steve, do you think Kai Wynn from DS9 is basically just Nurse Ratched with a wrinkly nose? I don't know. Nurse Ratched was mostly just a sadist. I got the impression from Nurse Ratched that she was a sadist and she used the rules as sort of her shield to inflict pain on people because she kind of got off on that. She enjoyed being the person in authority that held the other people down and made them do what, you know, she told them to do. And Kai Wynn had that element to her, but she was a lot more complex too. You know, she had the ambition and she had the need to be approved by the prophets and to be celebrated. Like Kai Wynn had a lot bigger issues than Nurse Ratched, but obviously apart from them being played by the same actors, yes, there are definitely some similarities. Sabrina Lozitas Meredith, what will you be watching this Halloween? Are you going classic or modern with your scary movies? Have you seen the new version of It yet? Well, no, I have not seen the new It yet, but as for Halloween, we usually go classic. And this year was no exception. We watched The Wolfman. What else did we watch? We watched The Invisible Man, which is an old standby of ours. We usually go classic Universal horror, and that's what we did this year. That's one of my favorite parts of Halloween, is watching the classic old horror movies. Lucas Hackett, yo Steve. Which one out of these 5 fictional characters would make a better pet for you? Scooby-Doo, Garfield, Snoopy, Astro, or Dino? Garfield. I practically have Garfield now. I mean, Audie is pretty much Garfield, you know. She is completely, you know, autonomous. As long as I have food and water and a litter box for her, she completely takes care of herself. If she needs something from me, she comes and talks to me. If she doesn't, then she does her own thing. You know, that's just it's a very Garfield experience, and I feel like that's what I have anyway. So that's what I would go for, Garfield, the adorable, very low maintenance pet. Der Wunderbar Bar, what medical show would you prefer to binge on from these? Grey's Anatomy, ER, Chicago Hope, House, Night Shift, or Nip Tuck? I have already seen every single episode of House, so I would go with Chicago Hope. Because I remember I used to watch Chicago Hope when it was on. And I never watched ER, and I always watched Chicago Hope. I was one of those guys. Everybody else was drinking Coke, and I was over in the corner with my fucking RC Cola going, well, I think this is better. That was me. Chicago Hope was my RC Cola. But I always liked it. And it's been so long since I've seen it. So I would probably want to do a Chicago Hope binge if I had to pick one from that list. David Edwards, on the same topic of local stations, I was always wondering why local newspapers didn't offer the local news as a morning podcast. The text is clearly available in time for several narrators to voice the stories and then to be edited into a single podcast. This could be listened to as part of the morning drive, jog, or start of the workday, if allowed. It would seem to me that it would add an easier to access form of local news, which always seems to be dying, which would be fit into busy schedules. Thoughts? I think this is brilliant. I can't believe that newspapers haven't done this already. This is a brilliant idea. And I agree with you. You take the stories from the paper and you just release them in audio form. And you know, papers, they could release the podcast for free or as a part of like a subscription deal, or if, you know, they could put ads in it. Like you could do like a 15-20 minute morning radio show, basically, like a morning podcast every day with the major news stories. Put a little ad at the beginning and at the end, or have sponsorships or whatever. And it's another source of income for the paper, which, as you say, is always in need of further sources of revenue because they're shrinking all the time. I think that's a really great idea. I can't believe people haven't done that yet. Scott Bressinger. As a fellow English major, I have fond memories of reading and writing poetry of wildly varying quality. What about you? Have you tried your hand at poetry, either as part of a class or on your own, and would you care to favor us with a verse? I promise not to judge, at least not out loud. I have written poetry before. I still occasionally will write a limerick because I love writing limericks. It's a very easy form and a very fun form to do. But yeah, I had to write some poetry in college for a writing course, and I actually, after I read your question, I went back and looked at my final project or my final poetry project, and some of it was and some of it was pretty rough. Whew. And I would never inflict that on you. So no, I'm not going to share any of the poetry with you, but some of it was okay, I guess, and some of it was just, oh wow, that was bad. How could I have written that? So yeah, I have dabbled. John Brockman, have you heard about this new conference happening in NYC? Sometime next year, I think. What do you think? With all the shitty people in the atheist movement, how could a new one be any good? Well, because the shitty people aren't invited to this one. It's TAC, the Atheist Conference. It's going to be awesome. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that actually at the end. So stay tuned. But yes, John, thank you very much for bringing that up. TAC in New York City next year, July 6, 7, and 8. It's going to be awesome, and the shitty people aren't invited. That's why it's going to be better. Shadowman 4710, lightning round question: Greek or Norse mythology? Yeah, there's actually a serious question buried in there. I have to go Greek because that's the only one that I have even a passing familiarity with. I never got into Norse mythology. I never researched it or read about it myself. And we learned very little, if any, about it in college. I took a mythology course in college, and it was Greco-Roman for the most part. And that was fascinating, but that's all I really have, right? I just have a little bit of Greco-Roman mythology knowledge, and that's it. So I have to go with that, just out of necessity. Hazen, hey Steve, what do you think of the Matrix movies? I think the Matrix movies are very well executed, very fun, goofy action movies that were somehow misinterpreted by a lot of people as being deep philosophical statements. I think as deep philosophical statements, they're preposterous and ridiculous and occasionally kind of offensive, but as just, you know, mindless, silly, goofy, big action movies, as action schlock, I think they're incredibly entertaining. But in terms of the philosophy, watch Dark City instead. Dark City is a much better movie and handles its themes in a much better way. Dylan Jones, do you have any tattoos? If you do, what are they? If you don't, what tattoo would you get? I don't have any tattoos. I don't think I would get one. I love tattoos. Tattoos are very cool, but I just can't think of anything that I would want to have on there permanently. Like there's nothing that I feel like I need that on my body, so it never comes off. I just can't think of anything, and there's nothing that I want that badly to have on there. It's like a t-shirt you can't ever take off. You know what I mean? I just can't think of anything that I would want that bad. But yeah, in general, I think tattoos are awesome. I just don't have any and can't really think that I would ever get one. Sorry. Just add that to the list of things that are very, very boring about me. That's a long list. Oh boy, that's a long list. But can't really get into tattoos for himself. Should be on that list somewhere. Anyway, that's it for the questions. It's time now for the shout out. And the shout out this week goes to an artist whose work you may have seen if you follow a lot of progressive YouTubers on Twitter, including myself and also folks like ContraPoints or H-Bomber Guy. This shout out goes to the artist who has drawn some really, really awesome portraits of those folks and lots of other people. It's Skutch. And you can follow Skutch on Twitter at SkutchDraws. And on his Twitter profile, you can also check out his awesome artwork. He does portraits of progressive YouTubers and also just does all kinds of other art in all different genres and all different styles. He's a fantastically talented artist who was kind enough to draw a portrait of me for no charge. He just does that sometimes. He draws portraits of people that he likes, and I have it as my user pick now in all my social media. It's wonderful. It turned out so well. His art that he's done, inspired by ContraPoints, has been fantastic. He's done a lot of really funny portraits of H-Bomber Guy. He did a really beautiful one of Christy Winters that looks just adorable. He did one of Mike Rowland's. And it's a lot of people. He's done portraits of a lot of people, a lot of really cool people, and he himself is a cool person. So follow him on Twitter at SkutchDraws. And you can also watch an interview that chrisiousity, another wonderful person, did with Skutch. That's linked in the description of this video. She had him on for a hangout. They talked for about an hour and a half about his art and his inspirations and where he comes from and who he is, and it was really, really cool. So watch that video as well if you're interested in Skutch. Skutch at SkutchDraws on Twitter. Awesome artist. That's the shout out. I also want to remind you, as John brought up in a lightning round question, make your reservations and buy your tickets now for TAC, the Atheist Conference that is coming to New York City next year, July 6, 7, and 8. Go to theatheistconference.com to learn more, to see a list of speakers, including myself and Christy Winters and Foxy Jezebel and Aaron Ron, ContraPoints and the One Janitor and Hemet Mehta and David Silverman. And Mandisa Thomas, who I believe is going to be the keynote speaker. It's a fantastic roster that they have already, and of course many more names yet to be added because it doesn't happen till July, so there's going to be a lot of additions to the program, and it's going to be just wonderful. The first Atheist Conference of its kind in New York City at the Roosevelt Hotel. And it's a beautiful hotel. If you register through our website, you get a fantastic discount on the rate, and you get to spend an awesome weekend in New York City and spend 3 days at a wonderful atheist conference that is trying to do things the right way: progressive, inclusive, forward-thinking, positive. And I'm so looking forward to it, and I hope I get to meet some of you there, and I'm looking forward to meeting a lot of the other speakers who are going to be there that are many people I haven't met before myself either. So it's going to be awesome. So make your reservations, get your tickets now for TAC, the Atheist Conference, theatheistconference.com. It's going to be great. I also want to remind you, as I always do, to check out the Lemme Listen family of podcasts. These are podcasts that are created by my very good friend Jason Harding, and I want to specifically draw your attention to the Late Seating podcast, which is the movie review podcast that Jason co-hosts with me, where we take a fresh look at a movie that has a reputation of either being good or bad. We give it a fresh review, we make fun of it, and we decide for ourselves whether or not the movie deserves whatever reputation it has, whether it's reputed to be a classic or not so much of a classic. You can listen to our most recent episode now, which was our Halloween-themed show about Plan 9 from Outer Space, and you can get ready for our next episode, which drops next week, which will be a review of the Michael Jordan Bugs Bunny vehicle, Space Jam. So watch Space Jam sometime between now and then so you can do a little bit of homework and you get all the jokes, and then you can listen to our review of Space Jam next week. For now, you can listen to our Plan 9 episode and all of the past episodes of Late Seating and all of the episodes of all of the awesome Lemme Listen podcasts by going to lemmelistenpodcast.com. That's it for me, everybody. I am done for another week. I want to thank you all for watching, and thank you all especially for your questions. If you want to have a question on next week's episode, leave a comment on this video asking me your question for the next You Had to Ask. You can ask me anything about anything. Nothing is too serious. Nothing is too silly. I will answer as many of your questions as I possibly can. But you have to ask, so please do comment on this video asking me your question for the next episode. That's it for me, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Take care. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe. And also please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel. Thanks for watching.